June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. No shouting, no slogans, no speeches, just the sound of boots on gravel and nothing else. The truck stopped, and for a moment no one moved. Heat pressed down like a weight, thick and unmoving, the Texas sun bleaching color from everything it touched. He stayed seated, hands clenched around the canvas strap above him, waiting for the noise to begin. It always began with noise. Orders barked, insults hurled. A voice raised to remind you who you were and what you had lost. Nothing came. They climbed down, one by one. Gravel shifted under boots that had crossed deserts and hedgerows, boots that had marched to shouted rhythms and anthems. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, prepared for the first blow, prepared to be made an example of, prepared for the lecture that would follow the one they had promised him, since training the enemy would break you, then rebuild you wrong. No one touched him. An American soldier stood at a folding table with a clipboard. He wore a plain uniform, sleeves rolled, collar open at the throat. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired in a way that suggested long hours, not hatred. When it was his turn, the soldier glanced up, asked for his name, and wrote it down. No comment, no sneer. The pencil scratched, paused, scratched again. Step aside. That was it. He waited for the next part, the explanation, and the accusation, and the speech about democracy or defeat or crimes. He had heard them in his head for weeks during the crossing, rehearsed his answers, practiced his silence. He had been warned that Americans loved to talk, that they would drown him in words until he forgot his own. They did not. Another soldier pointed toward a long wooden barracks. The gesture was casual, almost bored, the way a man points toward a road he has walked 100 times. Inside, cots stood in neat rows, each with a folded blanket and a thin mattress. He chose one at random and sat down. The wood creaked beneath his weight. No guard hovered. No eyes lingered. A mess hall stood beyond the barracks. The smell reached him before he entered, bread, coffee, something hot and filling. He hesitated at the door, suspicion tightening his chest. Food had always come with conditions. Food was leverage. He stepped inside anyway and joined the line. Trays slid along metal rails. Portions were ladled without ceremony. The man serving did not look at his face long enough to measure guilt or loyalty. He looked only to make sure the plate was full. He ate slowly, waiting for someone to stop him. No one did. In his training, they had explained captivity in precise terms. There would be punishment. There would be humiliation. There would be a program. He had memorized the word for it, re-education. He expected posters, slogans, lessons delivered with forced smiles. He expected the enemy to insist on being heard. The enemy was quiet. Outside, the camp moved with a steady rhythm. Guards walked their routes without urgency. Prisoners were counted, directed, left alone. Work details formed and dissolved. The only raised voices came when someone did not hear an instruction the first time, and even then the tone held no fury, only impatience. This was not the soundscape of fear he knew. It was something else, order, without intimidation. He lay on his cot that night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the crackle of loudspeakers that never came. In Germany, silence meant danger. It meant something was about to happen. Here, it seemed to mean the opposite. Here, silence was allowed to exist on its own. He learned pieces of the truth in fragments. Not from lectures, but from passing remarks, from the numbers scribbled on forms, from the scale of the place itself. This was not one camp among a few. This was a system. Hundreds like it scattered across a country so large it took days to cross by train. In this year alone, tens of thousands of men like him were arriving, captured in Africa. Italy, France, processed, housed, fed. More than 300,000 German prisoners, someone said, as if reciting the weather. The number made no sense. He tried to picture it and failed. He had been taught that the enemy was stretched thin, decadent, disorganized. He had been taught that captivity would be a spectacle designed to prove a point. Instead, he found himself inside a machine that did not seem interested in him at all. It did not need his agreement. It did not need his confession. That unsettled him more than blows would have. War, as he had known it, was loud. Marching songs, speeches amplified across squares, orders shouted to drown out doubt. Noise had been the proof of strength. Here, in the middle of a war that spanned continents and consumed millions, strength wore a different face. It did not shout. It wrote names on clipboards. It issued blankets. It served meals and moved on. He turned onto his side, the sounds of the camp settling into night around him. Somewhere a guard's footsteps faded. Somewhere a door closed gently. No one told him what to think before sleep took him. The loudest war in human history was being fought by a country that didn't need to shout. And, lying there in the dark, he realized that the silence, this calm, unremarkable quiet, was not an absence at all. It was a presence. One he did not yet understand and could not ignore. The silence did not reassure him. It unsettled him. By the second morning, he was certain it was a trick. Silence, he told himself, was simply a pause before instruction. The Americans were patient. They would let the quiet stretch until it made him lean forward, until he begged to be told what was expected of him. That was how proper re-education worked. You broke a man not with force but with uncertainty, then offered clarity on your own terms. He watched for signs. He listened for changes in tone. Every announcement, every gathering of prisoners, every summons to a work detail felt like the beginning of something else. Each time it ended the same way, with practical instructions and no explanation. In the barracks, men whispered at night. Some swore they had seen pamphlets stacked in an office. Others claimed classes were coming, that the Americans were waiting until the camp was full. A former non-commissioned officer insisted this was all preparation, that the real pressure would arrive once they were settled, weakened by comfort. He wanted to believe that. It made sense of the unease tightening his chest. The voices from home filled the gap the Americans left behind. They rose in his head while he stood in line, while he scrubbed tools, while he lay awake staring at the ceiling. The cadence was familiar, drilled into him until it felt like his own thinking. They told him what this silence meant. They told him what would come next. "They will wash your mind clean," the voice said. "They will make you ashamed of your uniform. They will teach you to betray the fatherland with a smile." He repeated these warnings to himself like a prayer. Without them, the quiet threatened to become something else, something that required thought. Days passed. Work assignments rotated. Some men were sent to repair fences beyond the wire. Others cleaned kitchens, unloaded supplies, stacked lumber. The tasks were dull, repetitive, and strangely ordinary. Guards explained what needed to be done, then stepped back. They did not hover. They did not correct ideology. They corrected mistakes with gestures and short sentences, the way one worker corrects another. The absence of pressure felt like pressure. He began to notice how little time anyone had to spare. Guards rotated constantly, young men and older ones, some with farm accents, some with voices shaped by cities he had only seen on maps. They carried letters in their pockets, folded thin from rereading. They talked about brothers overseas, about sons not yet old enough to shave. Their conversations were practical weather equipment shipments arriving late. The world beyond the fence pressed in through these fragments. America, in this year of the war, was stretched across oceans. Millions of men were gone from their towns, their fields, their factories. The work still had to be done. Crops still had to be harvested. Trains still had to run. Nothing waited for ideology. He watched trucks roll through the camp loaded with supplies, food, tools, crates stamped with dates and destinations. Everything moved with purpose. It did not pause to explain itself. He began to understand the scale of it in pieces. A guard mentioned a brother somewhere in France. Another spoke of cousins in the Pacific. A clerk complained about the endless paperwork required to track prisoners scattered across dozens of camps. Numbers surfaced and disappeared in conversation too large to grasp all at once. This was not a country improvising. This was a country organizing. And organization, he had been taught, was Germany's domain. The fear shifted shape. It was no longer fear of pain or punishment. It was fear of being irrelevant. He had expected to be the center of attention, an object to be corrected. Instead, he was a small component in a system that did not need his consent. It did not argue with him. It did not persuade. It simply absorbed him and moved on. He waited for the lecture that would explain why this way of life was superior. He waited for the moral justification that would reveal the trap. None came. Meals arrived on schedule. Work details were posted. Names were called and checked off. The days arranged themselves without ceremony. The quiet gave his own thoughts room to move, and that frightened him more than any shouted order ever had. At night, he replayed the warnings again, forcing them to the surface. He pictured classrooms filled with charts and slogans, American officers explaining history the wrong way. He imagined being asked questions designed to catch him in doubt. He prepared answers in advance, rehearsed defiance in his head. No one asked. One afternoon, while repairing a length of fence under a sun that burned the skin raw, he glanced at the guard posted nearby. The man leaned against a post hat, pulled low eyes scanning the horizon more than the prisoners. He looked bored, not vigilant. The realization struck him suddenly, and without mercy this guard was not watching for ideological weakness. He was watching for loose wire, for cattle that might wander, for weather that might turn. The thought unsettled him deeply. If no one was trying to convince him of anything, then the only voice shaping his days was his own. He had not heard his own voice clearly in years. It had always been layered beneath commands and chants, beneath certainty provided from above. Here, certainty was absent. Here, he was expected to function without being told what to believe. That expectation felt like exposure. He noticed small things that did not fit the stories he carried. Guards corrected each other openly. A younger man argued with an older one about how to stack crates, then shrugged when he was proven wrong. No one punished him for the disagreement. No one questioned his loyalty. The argument ended with the task completed, and both men moving on. In the world he had known, disagreement had been dangerous. Here it seemed unremarkable. The fear grew quieter but heavier, settling into his stomach like something undigested. He began to understand why the Americans did not shout. They did not need to. Their strength did not depend on being heard. It depended on things working on trains, arriving fields, producing factories, humming camps, running with minimal friction. This, he realized with a tightening throat, was more difficult to fight than an enemy who demanded attention. He returned to his cot each night exhausted not from punishment, but from the effort of waiting. Waiting for the moment when the silence would break and reveal its purpose. Waiting for someone to tell him what was expected beyond the simple completion of tasks. Waiting for the enemy to show its true face. It never did. The absence became the message, and the message was terrifying. America did not argue with him. It did not try to reshape his thoughts through force or persuasion. It assumed he would do his work, eat his meals, sleep, and continue. It assumed the system was enough. Lying awake in the dark, he felt the first crack form not yet in belief, but in certainty. If this was how the Americans fought the war, if this quiet competence was their weapon, then perhaps the danger was not what they might do to him. Perhaps the danger was what the silence would allow him to see. Work began without ceremony. A list was posted near the barracks, names written in block letters, assignments noted beside them. He found his name and read the word that followed it twice, as if expecting another line to appear. Fence repair. He waited for the explanation that did not come. A guard pointed toward a truck, nodded once, and that was enough. They drove out beyond the wire, early, the air already heavy with heat. Tools were handed out. The task was shown once slowly with gestures rather than commands. The guard finished by straightening up and saying almost to himself, "Do your job. That's it." Then he stepped back. No one asked him what he believed. No one asked him who he had voted for or whom he had served. No one asked him to confess anything. They worked until sweat soaked through cloth and dust settled into skin. When a wire sagged, someone fixed it. When a post leaned, it was set straight. The work was physical, honest, and entirely uninterested in his inner life. That indifference felt strange at first, then quietly relieving. At midday, they were handed water and told to sit in the shade. No one rushed them. No one counted the minutes with a watch. When the break ended, a guard cleared his throat and pointed back toward the fence. It was not an order, so much as a reminder that time moved forward whether anyone shouted or not. Payment came at the end of the week. He had not expected it. Camp scrip was placed in his hand, counted carefully, the amount explained in plain terms. He stared at the paper for a long moment before folding it into his pocket. The idea that his labor had value even here felt disorienting. In his world, work had been duty. Here it was something else. A transaction completed without comment. Meals continued to arrive with the same quiet regularity. He noticed that the guards ate the same food. Not better, not separate. They lined up at the same counter trays, sliding along the same rails. There was no ceremony in this, either no sense that generosity was being performed. Food was food. People ate because people needed to eat. He tested it cautiously, waiting for the hidden cost. None appeared. The routine settled in. Wake, count, work, eat, sleep. Days passed without incident, and within that repetition, small acts accumulated, none remarkable on their own. A guard paused to show a better way to grip a tool, then walked away. Another replaced a torn glove without comment. When someone fell ill, he was sent to the infirmary and returned days later, thinner, but alive, treated, and rested. These things did not arrive as announcements. They were not framed as kindness. They were simply how the camp functioned. He began to understand that this was not accidental. The Americans had rules, and they followed them. The Geneva Convention was not a slogan here. It was a checklist. Shelter provided. Food sufficient. Work assigned fairly. Payment accounted for. There was no drama in compliance, no self-congratulation. The system existed to keep order, and order was maintained not through fear but through predictability. Someone explained it once not as a lesson but as a practical observation. Well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems. Men who slept and worked and ate did not riot. Decency applied consistently saved time. That explanation disturbed him more than any moral argument could have. He watched guards move through their shifts with a kind of tired competence. Many of them were older than he was, some younger. They carried themselves like men who had left something unfinished at home. When letters arrived, they were read quickly and folded away. When news came from overseas, it was absorbed without ceremony. There was no triumph in their posture, only endurance. He noticed how rarely anyone spoke of ideals. No one tried to explain what America stood for. No one needed to. The camp itself was the explanation, running day after day without cruelty and without apology. Kindness appeared in repetition, not in moments designed to be remembered. A second ladle of stew when portions ran low. A nod instead of a rebuke. A brief pause to let an exhausted man catch his breath. These gestures accumulated quietly, wearing down resistance not through persuasion, but through exposure. He felt it happening, and did not know how to stop it. The fear from before did not vanish. It transformed. He found himself uneasy, not because he was being threatened, but because he was not. Without pressure to push against his own assumptions, had nothing to brace themselves on. The stories he carried from home began to feel brittle, cracking at the edges under the weight of daily experience. He told himself that this kindness was calculated, that it was strategy, not sentiment. That did not make it less effective. One afternoon, rain broke the heat without warning, heavy drops turning dust into mud. Work stopped. Tools were gathered. No one shouted. The guard waved them toward the truck, shaking his head at the sky. Back at camp, wet clothes were exchanged for dry ones. The schedule adjusted itself without comment. That night, lying on his cot, he realized something unsettling. He had passed the entire day without thinking about ideology. He had thought about his hands sore and blistered. He had thought about water and shade and the smell of wet earth. He had thought about finishing a task correctly. The absence of instruction had given his mind a space, and that space was filling with something unexpected. Not loyalty, not gratitude. Something quieter. Recognition. He began to see the outlines of the country that had built this place, a nation that could afford to be unhurried, that could assign men to guard other men without convincing them of anything, that could feed enemies without explaining why. This was not weakness. It was confidence so complete it did not require reinforcement. He imagined the farms and factories beyond the fence, the rail lines stretching toward coasts he had never seen. He imagined men and women working without being watched, trusted to do what needed doing. The camp felt like a small piece of a much larger machine, one that did not revolve around belief, but around function. That realization stirred something he did not yet have words for. The kindness did not crescendo. It did not announce itself. It remained steady, unremarkable, repeating day after day. And in that repetition it became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. They did not try to convert him. They did not need to. They let him be fed, clothed, occupied, counted, and in doing so they allowed him to experience a world where power did not need to humiliate in order to maintain itself. A world where decency was not a performance but a habit. He did not feel saved. He did not feel forgiven. He felt something more dangerous to the beliefs he had carried across the ocean. He felt treated as a man whose labor mattered and whose thoughts were his own. And somewhere beneath the surface of routine, beneath the quiet kindness that asked nothing of him, the first sense of pride stirred not in himself but in the unsettling realization of what this country at war and under strain chose to be anyway. The silence did not end. It deepened. At first it had been something he waded through like a pause before instruction. Then it became something he worked inside of, moving from task to task without being told why. Now it followed him into places he could not escape. It followed him into sleep. It waited for him when he woke. There were still no slogans, no banners, no lessons delivered in tidy rows. No one gathered them to explain what kind of men they were supposed to become. Days passed without a single attempt to shape his thoughts. The American seemed content to let his mind remain untouched. That was when he began to hear it, his own voice. It was not loud at first. It crept in during moments when his hands were busy and his attention slackened, while stacking lumber, while scrubbing pots, while staring at the horizon as heat shimmered above the fields. Thoughts surfaced that had nowhere to go before. Questions formed without being crushed by answers supplied in advance. He realized with a tightening in his chest that his entire youth had been filled with noise. Commands shouted from podiums, songs blaring from loudspeakers, marches pounding through streets until the ground itself seemed to vibrate with certainty. Silence had never been neutral. Silence had been dangerous. It had meant disobedience or doubt. Noise had kept doubt away. Here there was nothing to drown it out. At night, lying on his cot, he found himself replaying scenes he had not examined in years. Faces from rallies, the swell of voices chanting in unison, the thrill of belonging to something that demanded nothing more than obedience. He remembered how loyalty had been measured not by thought but by volume, how loudly one shouted, how quickly one repeated the words. Loyalty, he realized now, had always been fear dressed as conviction. The thought struck him without warning, and once it arrived, it refused to leave. He began to compare without intending to. In Germany, sound had been everywhere. Loudspeakers crackled to life at dawn. Music poured from windows. Parades filled streets with banners and boots and drums. Even private spaces were invaded by expectation. One was never alone with one's thoughts. They were always supervised, always guided. Here, sound served purpose and then disappeared. Tools clanked, trucks passed. Men spoke when necessary and stopped when they were done. Families existed somewhere beyond the fence, implied rather than displayed. Life continued without spectacle. The contrast gnawed at him. He noticed how arguments ended quickly, how disagreements resolved themselves through work rather than authority, how no one demanded agreement, only competence. He watched a guard accept correction from another without embarrassment. He watched men shrug and adjust rather than defend pride. This, he realized, was a kind of freedom he had never been taught to recognize, and it frightened him. Without constant reinforcement, the beliefs he had carried began to feel fragile. They had relied on repetition, on volume, on shared performance. In the quiet, they stood alone, and alone, they felt uncertain. He resisted the realization at first. He told himself that this was weakness creeping in, that comfort was eroding resolve. He repeated familiar phrases under his breath, testing their weight. They sounded thinner than he remembered. One evening, after lights out, he borrowed a pencil and a scrap of paper. He did not know why he wrote. There was no one to read it. The act itself felt forbidden, like stepping into a room he had been told was locked. He stared at the page for a long time before the words came. "No one here tells me what to think, and that terrifies me." He read the sentence again and felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes. The terror was not of punishment or pain. It was the terror of responsibility. If no one commanded his thoughts, then whatever he believed belonged to him. The camp offered no relief from that realization. It did not correct him. It did not reassure him. It simply continued day after day, functioning without him at the center of anything. He began to notice how American life seeped into the margins of the camp. Letters arrived and departed. Packages were distributed. Guards spoke of children of kitchens of small towns and distant cities. These conversations were not meant for him, yet they shaped the air around him. They spoke of a society that did not require constant affirmation to exist. Families, he realized, lived without being told what to chant. Work continued. Meals were served, order held, and none of it depended on belief. The breakdown did not come all at once. It arrived in waves. A moment of clarity followed by retreat. A thought aloud, then rejected. Each time the silence returned, it pressed a little harder, reflecting his thoughts back at him without judgment. He found himself mourning something he could not name. The certainty he had once worn like armor had protected him from doubt, from complexity, from choice. In its absence, he felt exposed. But he also felt for the first time awake. He remembered the parades again, how they had felt exhilarating, overwhelming, irresistible. He remembered how easily he had surrendered his voice to the crowd, how comforting it had been to shout until thought dissolved into sound, how terrifying it would have been to stand still and say nothing. Here, standing still was ordinary. The Americans did not seem to fear silence. They trusted it. They trusted that work would be done without shouting, that men would show up without being forced, that systems would hold without constant reinforcement. This trust was not spoken. It was assumed, and that assumption shook him more than any threat could have. He began to understand the true contrast between the worlds he had known and the one he now occupied. One relied on pressure to maintain unity. The other relied on structure and habit. One demanded constant affirmation. The other required none. This was not mercy as he had understood it. It was something colder and paradoxically more generous. It did not care what he believed as long as he functioned. It did not demand gratitude. It did not seek validation. In the quiet, his defenses eroded, not violently, but steadily. Each day, the mirror held up by silence reflected more clearly the distance between who he had been told to be and who he actually was. He felt the breakdown as a loss of orientation. The old markers no longer guided him. The familiar slogans no longer steadied his steps. He was left navigating by observation, by experience, by his own judgment. It was exhausting, and it was unavoidable. When he lay awake at night now, the terror was sharper but cleaner. He no longer waited for the lecture. He no longer expected the shouting to begin. He understood with a clarity that left him breathless that the silence was not temporary. It was the point. In that realization, something inside him gave way, not in collapse, but in surrender. Not to the Americans, not to a new doctrine, but to the fact that the noise he had depended on had been doing more than uniting him. It had been thinking for him. The silence did not offer answers. It offered space. And in that space he began unwillingly and without guidance to confront the shape of his own mind. The mirror did not lie. The understanding did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly the way most truths do when no one is trying to force them. It happened one morning near the fence line. The post had shifted after a storm, leaning just enough to pull the wire loose. No whistle blew. No order was given. A guard noticed it while walking past, stopped, tested the tension with his hand, and set his rifle down against the dirt. He knelt, braced the post, and began to work the wire back into place. Another guard saw him and joined without a word. A third followed, carrying tools from the truck. They worked together for several minutes, movements practiced and efficient, each man anticipating what the others needed without discussion. When the wire held, one of them nodded, picked up his rifle, and continued on his route. That was all. No command, no explanation, no credit taken. The prisoner watched from a few steps away, struck by the simplicity of it. In his world, action required instruction. Responsibility flowed downward through ranks and titles. Nothing moved unless someone higher up demanded it. Here, responsibility seemed to exist everywhere at once, waiting to be claimed by whoever saw the need. He felt something settle into place. Freedom, he realized, did not look like chaos. It looked like trust. Trust that work would be done without threats. Trust that men would act without being ordered. Trust that systems would hold because the people inside them believed they should. This was not freedom as spectacle. There were no speeches declaring it, no flags waved to prove it existed. It lived in small decisions repeated daily by people who did not think of themselves as performing anything extraordinary. He thought back to the noise he had grown up in. The insistence that truth had to be shouted to survive. That belief required amplification to remain convincing. Here, truth did not announce itself. It functioned. He began to see how deeply this way of life was woven into everything around him. The camp ran on schedules that rarely slipped. Supplies arrived when they were supposed to. Equipment was repaired before it failed. Problems were addressed early without drama. None of this depended on enthusiasm or belief. It depended on cooperation. Beyond the fence, he imagined the rest of the country moving with the same quiet momentum. Factories producing without pause. Railroads threading the continent together. Farms feeding cities whose workers built machines that crossed oceans. The scale of it was immense, yet it operated without the constant roar he had been taught was necessary to mobilize a nation. America did not shout because it did not need to convince itself of anything. The strength he sensed here was not emotional. It was structural. It came from habits formed long before the war habits of showing up, of doing one's part, of trusting that others would do the same. The war had intensified these habits, not replaced them. The country had become an arsenal, not through fear, but through coordination. He understood now why no one had tried to persuade him. Persuasion would have been unnecessary and inefficient. This system did not rely on belief to function. It relied on participation. The realization brought with it a strange sense of relief. He was not being tested. He was not being measured against an ideal. He was simply expected to exist within the rules of a society that assumed competence and cooperation as defaults. For the first time, he saw why this country could afford to treat its enemies as it did. Feeding prisoners, paying them. Letting them work, none of it weakened the system. It strengthened it by reinforcing the values that made it function in the first place. Decency was not charity. It was maintenance. The war, he realized, had not transformed America into something new. It had revealed what it already was. He thought of the slogans he had marched under, the certainty they had provided. They had offered clarity by simplifying the world into enemies and virtues that could be named and repeated. Here, clarity came from observing what worked, from watching men fix fences without orders and factories produce without applause. The difference was stark and humbling. He felt pride rise in him unexpectedly and uncomfortably, not in his past, not in his uniform, but in witnessing a form of strength he had not believed possible. A strength that did not need to humiliate or dominate to assert itself. A strength that trusted ordinary people to do extraordinary things without being told they were extraordinary. This, he understood, was why America was winning. Not because it shouted louder, not because it believed harder, but because it functioned because millions of people spread across a vast land trusted one another enough to keep moving in the same direction without being forced. Freedom did not need to shout here. It did not need to prove itself daily. It existed in the quiet confidence that tomorrow's work would be done, that the trains would run, that the lights would stay on, that the fences would be repaired by whoever noticed them leaning. He returned to his tasks with a different posture, not because anyone told him to change, but because something in him had aligned. The fear that had once tightened his chest loosened, replaced by a steady awareness of where he stood. He was still a prisoner. The wire still marked boundaries he could not cross. But within those limits he experienced a freedom he had not known before. The freedom to think without being directed to observe, without being corrected to exist, without being shouted at. That freedom carried weight. It demanded something of him. It asked him to choose how he would respond to the silence that surrounded him. As he worked, he began to understand that moral awakening did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived as recognition. Recognition of a society that trusted its people enough to let them be quiet. Recognition that truth, when it is solid, does not require amplification. He did not need anyone to explain this to him. The fence line had said enough. Freedom, he now knew, was built quietly by people who trusted each other to do the work without being told. And, standing there in the Texas sun, watching the camp move with its unremarkable efficiency, he felt the final resistance drain away. This was why America had become what it was. This was why it would endure. He carried the memory of that silence long after the war ended. It stayed with him through transport ships and border crossings, through ruins and rebuilding, through years that blurred together as Europe tried to remember how to live without commands. But it was only later, much later, that he understood what he had witnessed in America. At the time, it had simply felt different. Now, with distance, it felt rare. And America in the 1940s did not announce itself the way he had expected. It did not seem obsessed with being heard. Its power did not arrive as a chorus. It arrived as routine. People showed up to work. Machines ran. Trains moved. Food appeared on tables. Decisions were made without spectacle. A nation at war functioned without constant declaration. There were flags, of course. There were speeches. But they were not everywhere. They did not fill every silence. Much of American life unfolded without commentary, as if the country trusted its people to know what needed to be done. Looking back, the trust was the quiet engine beneath everything. Factories did not shout about production. They produced. Shipyards did not argue about purpose. They launched ships and returned to work. Farms did not debate whether feeding the country mattered. They harvested and sent the grain down the line. Millions of ordinary people moved in the same direction without being told every day why they should. The country did not need to scream because it believed itself. He wondered sometimes whether that belief came from hardship endured together, from a generation shaped by depression before war, by scarcity before abundance. People who had learned to value function over display. People who had learned that shouting wasted energy better spent working. When he thought of America now, decades later, the contrast was painful in its clarity. The noise was everywhere. voices competing to be heard, each louder than the last. Arguments stretched across screens and streets. Words piled upon words demanding attention, demanding agreement, demanding reaction. Certainty was performed constantly, as if it might evaporate without reinforcement. He did not judge this new America. He did not know it well enough to judge. But he noticed the difference the way one notices a change in weather instinctively, with a quiet sense of unease. In the America he had known, disagreement had existed without dominating everything. People argued, then went back to work. They did not need consensus to cooperate. They did not need to agree on everything to trust each other with the basics. Trust, he realized, was the missing sound. In the camp, trust had been assumed. Guards trusted prisoners to work. Prisoners trusted guards not to abuse them. The system functioned because it was built on the expectation that most people, most of the time, would do what was asked if treated with consistency and respect. That expectation felt fragile now. He thought about the factories that had once run day and night, about the towns that had organized themselves around production and purpose. He thought about the men he had seen guarding him, quiet, competent, uninterested in proving anything. Men who believed their work mattered even if no one applauded. He wondered what had changed. Not in policy, not in slogans, but in tone. America in the 1940s had trusted silence. It had allowed space between words. It had believed that action spoke loudly enough on its own. Today, it seemed less comfortable with quiet, as if silence invited doubt rather than reflection. He did not know when that shift occurred. He only knew that the silence he had encountered as a prisoner felt almost unimaginable now. Back then, power had been steady. It did not pulse with outrage. It did not seek constant affirmation. It existed in systems that held in routines, that repeated in institutions that did not collapse under the weight of disagreement. That kind of power was not exciting. It did not demand attention. But it endured. He thought of the fence being repaired without orders, of the guard who knelt in the dirt because it needed to be done. No one filmed it. No one argued about it. The wire held, and life continued. That moment, small and unremarkable, seemed almost radical now. When he listened to modern debates, so much noise devoted to proving who was right, he thought back to a time when being right mattered less than being useful, when competence carried more weight than conviction, when decency did not require explanation. The comparison did not lead him to anger. It led him to sadness, a quiet mourning for a kind of confidence that did not need to perform itself. He knew, of course, that the past was not perfect. The America he remembered had its own injustices, its own exclusions, its own silences that hid pain rather than wisdom. But there had been something solid beneath it all, a shared understanding that work mattered, that institutions mattered, that the future was something built, not argued into existence. That solidity felt thinner now. He wondered what it would mean for a country to trust silence again, to allow disagreement without treating it as existential threat, to return to the idea that action repeated consistently could speak louder than any slogan. He wondered whether such trust could be rebuilt once lost. The question lingered unanswered because it could not be answered by history alone. It belonged to the present. When did we stop trusting silence? The question was not an accusation. It was an invitation to remember that strength once took a quieter form, and that it might again if people were willing to listen to what was not being shouted. For the viewer sitting in a different America, the comparison was unavoidable. The story of a prisoner from a defeated nation became unexpectedly a mirror held up to the nation that had defeated him. Not to condemn, but to reflect. To ask whether the country that once did not need to scream still remembered how to speak softly and mean it. He went home without ceremony. There was no parade for men like him, no music waiting at the station. The war had burned too much of the world for celebrations to feel honest. He returned to a country flattened by loss and fatigue, where streets were quieter for reasons very different from the quiet he had learned to trust. Germany in the late 1940s did not shout either, but its silence was heavy, filled with absence. He rebuilt his life the way many did, piece by piece. He studied. He worked. He married. He became a father. In time, he stood in front of classrooms and courtrooms explaining rules and principles to people who wanted order more than ideology. He spoke carefully. He chose words that did not need to be raised. At home, the war stayed mostly untouched. He did not tell stories about battles. He did not recount marches or slogans or the faces of men who had died beside him. When his children asked, he answered simply, then redirected the conversation to homework or chores or the small rituals of daily life. The past, he seemed to believe, did not deserve to dominate the present. But there was one memory he allowed to remain. Sometimes, in moments that felt unplanned, a fence post leaning in a yard, a disagreement at the table, a child struggling with a task, he would mention America. Not the country as a concept, but a place, a camp, a moment, a man. He would speak of a guard who fixed a fence without being told, of work done quietly, of food served without commentary, of a silence that had not been empty. He never framed it as praise. He did not explain why it mattered. He simply described what he had seen and let the description stand. The lesson was never delivered as a lesson. His children grew up with these fragments. They did not always understand them at the time. The stories felt out of place amid the ruins and rebuilding of post-war Germany, but they stayed settling into memory like stones placed deliberately and left alone. Years later, those children told the story differently. He never talked about the war, one of them would say, but he talked about one American who didn't raise his voice. That sentence carried more weight than any battlefield account could have. It explained not what had happened, but what had endured. The grandchildren heard it next. By then, Germany had changed again. Borders shifted. Economies rose. The world grew smaller and louder. The story of the quiet American became something almost mythic, a reminder that power once looked different. Some of them traveled. Some studied history. A few searched archives and letters trying to place the fragments into a broader picture. They learned about the camps, about the numbers, about how many men had crossed an ocean and been held without being broken. They learned that what their grandfather had experienced was not an exception. That realization deepened the gratitude. They did not feel grateful because America had been kind to their family alone. They felt grateful because America had chosen a way of being that did not require cruelty even in war. A way of being that allowed an enemy to return home changed. For some of them, gratitude took the form of letters. Carefully written notes sent across the Atlantic addressed to institutions or towns or families whose names they did not know. They wrote not to apologize, but to acknowledge. Thank you for feeding him. Thank you for letting him work. Thank you for not shouting. Others carried the gratitude more quietly. They raised their children with an emphasis on responsibility over rhetoric, on work over noise. They repeated the story not often, but intentionally preserving its simplicity. America seen through the eyes of a former prisoner became something more than a victor. It became a teacher not through instruction, but through example. The silence had done its work. Decades later, as the world grew more uncertain and voices competed to be heard, the story acquired new relevance. It was shared at dinner tables and in classrooms not as a warning, but as a reminder. That strength could exist without spectacle. That freedom could be practiced without proclamation. The man who had once waited for a lecture never delivered one himself. He understood, perhaps better than most, that lectures were rarely what changed people. Experience did that. Consistency did that. Trust did that. When he died, there were no references to medals or campaigns in his eulogy. Friends spoke of his fairness, his patience, his refusal to raise his voice when anger would have been easier. Someone mentioned that he had learned those habits somewhere unexpected. Across generations, the story settled into its final form, not as history, but as inheritance. History remembers who won the war, but some families remember who taught them that freedom doesn't need to shout. That memory crossed borders more easily than armies ever had. It connected people who would never meet, bound by an understanding shaped in silence. An understanding that gratitude did not require ceremony, and that pride could exist without noise. What survived the silence was not allegiance or ideology. It was a way of seeing the world, a belief that dignity practiced quietly and consistently could outlast even the loudest war. And in that inheritance shared across oceans and generations, the story finally came to rest.